Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I am Stephanie Dion, the Associate Pastor here at Lowcountry Presbyterian Church, and we are so glad that you have joined us for this partnership event with the Pat Conroy Literary Center. We've gotten to host a few of these events, and we always welcome people from the community, and we also welcome you to join us any Sunday morning. If you need anything while you're here, we have people in the back who are able to direct you toward restrooms or whatever else you might need while you are on our campus. But we are glad that you are here. In this afternoon's closing session of the 6th annual Pat Conroy Literary Festival, bestselling author and Palmetto Bluff resident Patti Callahan will discuss her newest book, Once Upon a Wardrobe, in conversation with Lowcountry Weekly publisher Margaret Evans. Books will be available for sale after the program through the Beaufort Bookstore. Janet Skesley-Charles, award-winning author of the Paris Library, praised Once Upon a Wardrobe as a poignant meditation on the lengths we will go to for our loved ones, as well as a fascinating glimpse into the early years of C.S. Lewis's life. Patti Callahan's beautiful, life-affirming novel is a reminder that literature lives inside us, and that when we read someone else's story, we understand so much more about our own. Patti Callahan is the New York Times, USA Today, and Globe and Mail best-selling novelist of 15 novels, including the recent Becoming Mrs. Lewis and Surviving Savannah. A recipient of the Harper Lee Distinguished Writer of the Year, the Christie Book of the Year, and the Alabama Library Association Book of the Year, Patti is the co-founder and co-host of the popular web series and podcast, Friends and Fiction. Interviewer Margaret Evans is the publisher and editor of Lowcountry Weekly, where she has been penning her award-winning column, Rants and Raves, for over 20 years. Margaret's essays have appeared in State of the Heart, South Carolina Writers on the Places They Love, and our Prince of Scribes, Writers Remember Pat Conroy, and she's a regular contributor to Southbound magazine. Please join me in welcoming Patti Callahan and Margaret Evans.
I am the interrogator here.
I'm not scared.
You shouldn't be scared. Along with all of those accolades you just heard, Patti is also a very nice person. So I'm really happy to be up here with her.
So is Margaret, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
We have an ongoing conversation, although it's on Facebook. But
yes,
we have an ongoing conversation.
Big Facebook friends. And I told Patti when I got here that I had heard my song in the car on the way over from Beaufort, and I said, since we're exactly the same age and you went to college in my home state of Alabama and we think alike, sort of, I'm sure you know the song More Than a Feelin' by
and
Boston.
And then I started
right?
singing it. Who here owned that LP? Okay, thank you.
It's just us. It's just us. I don't know.
I played that thing till the grooves were gone.
So anyway, I digress. Patti, your new book is getting rave reviews. The Washington Post recently posted an excellent review wherein they said it's a love letter to books and stories with a meaningful message. Megs and her family learned that fantastical tales are more than mere ways to appease young children. Stories are nourishment for the souls that need joy the most, and sometimes they're the only thing that can help us understand life. Well, that's a nice little quote from the Washington Post, and that's definitely a feather in your cap. But my favorite review that I've read of the book is by the top Amazon reader on your Amazon page.
I haven't looked. I don't let myself
I know.
look.
Pat Conroy never looked at his Amazon page. But girl, you should look at yours because you got 5 stars on this book right now. Like 5 stars and hundreds of reviews, because I checked just today.
Okay. Well, now I don't have to look.
That's right. Are we too loud? No? I just wanted to read the beginning of this really long reader review because it, to me, it captures exactly what it feels like to read Once Upon a Wardrobe. And it starts out like this. Once upon a wardrobe, not very long ago and not very far away, a middle-aged girl, weighed down by the death, disease, disaster, and dissension screaming from the headlines, opened an email from a book review site. She had resolved not to agree to any more review books at present, but there it was, the cover artwork showing the dreaming spires of Oxford at blue hour, a Narnian lamppost garlanded with fresh snow in the foreground, the fairy tale title, Once Upon a Wardrobe, and a tiny lion's head like a door knocker inviting her into whatever adventure Aslan might have within. Resolve crumbled in the face of such a summons. Yes, please, and thank you, she clicked. When the galley ebook arrived in her inbox, she dropped everything to begin reading. As surely as Alice fell into Wonderland or Harry fell into Dumbledore's Pensieve, she promptly fell into this tale of Oxford Don C.S. Lewis helping a brother and sister learn to live in love, grief, and hope, all bound up together. The story raised the hair on the reader's arms in prickles of wonder. I'm sorry, I get teary. Brought a chuckle to her throat and a smile to her face, and repeatedly reduced her to tears as she read her Kindle in the backyard pool. It gave the sheerest, purest delight she'd felt in many weeks.
Oh, wow, I should go more often.
I thought that was so, you really should. It jibed with my own experience of reading Once Upon a Wardrobe, and that's why I wanted to read it. Reading the book feels like drifting into a fairy tale or a bedtime story, even though there's nothing supernatural about it. There are no Narnian creatures. And I'm wondering, did you do that on purpose?
So I'm going to tell you a teeny bit about the book to answer that. Yes, I mean, the short answer is yes. I wanted it to feel like a kind of dreamy world, like somebody was reading it to you, like Megs reads it to George. But for those of you who don't know much about the book, the year is 1950, and it is winter, and it is in Oxford and Worcester, England. And there is a young boy named George, and he's ill, and he is obsessed with a brand new book that burst onto the scene exactly 71 years later. A little thin volume called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And he reads that book back to front and front to back. He wants to see if the back of his wardrobe will pop out and he can walk into the land of Narnia. And he has a sister named Megs, who is a math and physics genius and attends Oxford University. And she attends Somerville College, which is one of the few colleges in 1950 that allowed women at Oxford University. And she comes home one weekend, and her brother says to her, "You have to read this new book that just came out. A professor at your university wrote it." And she looks and she goes, "Oh, that's so nice, George, just a little children's book." And he says, "No, it's much more than that. You need to read it." And she says, "I have bigger and better things to do, and I'm studying for exams." And he says, "I need you to find this professor, and I need you to ask him where this magical land came from." And she says, "Absolutely not. The world is founded on logic and math. Meg is a math and physics genius, a prodigy. And she believes that she, along with Einstein, will find the theory of everything, and that theory of everything will be an equation, not a story." And yet, her brother is relentless, and she loves him. So she tracks down C.S. Lewis at the university and asks him, where did this magical land come from? And she just wants a simple answer to take home to her brother. But I don't think Lewis has probably ever given a simple answer in his life. And instead of giving her an answer, he gives her stories. And I wanted it to feel that way. I wanted it to feel like there was magic in it, even though we were grounded in the real world. I wanted us to see, and Megs to see, that the ordinary can be transformed through the alchemy of story into the extraordinary. And in order to do that, I would get myself in kind of a place that felt like I was telling the story to my child at bedtime, and that doesn't mean it's told in simplistic terms, but I tried to echo the storytelling of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in that not simple way, but not flowery way. Just these are the beautiful things happening in the world.
I think you did a wonderful job. We discussed when we were doing the magazine interview. Can y'all hear me still?
Yeah.
Yeah?
So great.
Feels weird. I wondered who you thought of as your readership for this book, because as I read it, I thought, I can't tell if I'm reading an adult novel or a young adult novel, and I don't really care. I happen to love young adult novels, but I thought, I don't think Patti's ever written a young adult novel, and I don't think she set out to write one, but I thought, I think Patti just opened up her audience quite a bit with this one. Do you feel that way? Has anybody else said that to you?
Yes, I think, it's, not to put the name Stephen King and C.S. Lewis in the same sentence, but it is Stephen King who says
I like
that.
Stephen King.
Yeah, I do too. But, I think that it is he who says in his writing book that you should have an ideal reader when you're writing. That's part of his writing advice. But for me, maybe it's selfish. My ideal reader is me. And, I write about what I'm curious about. And so if I'm curious about something, for example, I was curious about Joy Davidman. Who was this fiery, genius, interesting, I know, complicated woman who married C.S. Lewis? For Surviving Savannah, I was curious about this lost to time shipwreck story. And for this, I was curious about the origins of Narnia. I've long been fascinated with origin stories. I took Latin in high school. I love mythology. Did you? That's it. One of our many. And so I'm interested in the origin of words and the origin of stories and mythology. So when I was writing this book, it was during the pandemic, and I think I told you this when we had our interview. It became this kind of still point in a madly burning world. That every day I could go to England and I could go to Narnia and I could ask Megs to take adventures with her brother and I could go with them while the world, meanwhile, was burning around me. And it's not hard to remember how terrified we were in March, April, and May of 2020, not knowing what we were facing, not knowing what was ahead of us. And this was my curiosity and my question mark. So when I was writing it, I was writing for me and for anyone who doesn't know how, in the beginning, to make meaning out of something that feels meaningless, if that makes sense. So that was my audience, was
you.
Me, but also
you and everybody else
all
like
of us
you.
trying to figure out, well, none of this is making any sense. How do we make sense out of it? What does this all mean? And Megs is trying to make sense out of something that feels very senseless.
Well, I will be looking forward to your pandemic explanation novel.
Oh gosh, no, thank you.
The one that makes meaning of the pandemic. That's the one I'm looking forward to.
Keep waiting, baby.
Okay, so I've asked you this before, and you said, you gave me a hard no, but I'm going to ask you again. While you were researching Becoming Mrs. Lewis, were you already beginning to think about this book?
I wasn't. When I was writing Becoming Mrs. Lewis, I was only thinking about Joy Davidman and how to tell her story from behind her eyes, from her point of view, from what I called the seat of her heart with the key of empathy, because so much had been written about her that I wanted to write from her point of view. But of course, when I was doing my research, I especially focused on the 8 to 10 years of their relationship, the letters Lewis wrote to other people. and also the work that he did during that time, those 10 years that they were pen pals, friends, and then married. And I kept seeing these little pieces of his life that he wrote about during the time he was married to Joy. For example, his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, and some letters he wrote in Till We Have Faces. I was seeing all these little moments in his life that I could see in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I am not a full Chronicles of Narnia expert. I didn't study them in school. I had no desire to pick it apart and give you an index and an appendix and tabs in a notebook. But what I did start to think about was how there are all these little moments in authors' lives that show up in their books, but there are also these large swaths of story source that are completely ineffable, completely mysterious, and completely unexplainable, even to the author themselves. For example, Lewis. When asked about when he started this book, he had 5 or 6 different answers because you can't pin down where something came from. And I wondered about it, but I didn't think I would write a book about it. And then I wrote Surviving Savannah, which was a couple-year journey of research and writing and digging through files and pounding the streets of Savannah, trying to find sources. And those little crumbs of his life, though, must have been brewing in the back of my mind. They must have been on that back burner of the subconscious, because when Surviving Savannah was done and dusted and in the chute in March of 2020, it didn't come out till March of 21, but we're usually finished with a book about 9 to 12 months before you see it. And then the pandemic hit, and I was wondering what to write, and all those little crumbs of his life started to turn into this story about the. So no is the short answer. I did not think about writing another Lewis book when I was writing Mrs. Lewis, but the seeds were there.
The seeds were planted. Well, in the book, you draw connections between Jack Lewis's life as a boy and a young man with the creation of Narnia, but they're fairly subtle, the connections that you make, and I'm wondering if those were hard to find for you, or if Lewis himself actually wrote about any of that, or you just drew those connections yourself. How hard, that was like a little mystery you had to follow. Was that difficult, or did it start to emerge very clearly?
It wasn't that difficult. What I did was I sat down one afternoon and I thought, okay, if I was going to do something like this, which I'm not, but if I was, even though I'm not, if I was.
Famous last words, right?
What are the 7 events or things I see in his life that I think I see in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Not, I wasn't looking at Prince Caspian or the full Chronicles, or I was looking at just that small slice of time in 1950 when only The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was out. Nobody knew it was going to be a series. Lewis didn't even know it was going to be a series when he wrote it. Then he thought he'd only write 4 of them. Then I started reading about it, and I ran across this opening line. There were once 4 children named Martin, Rose, somebody, and Peter. And I was like, that's weird. Like, it's almost right? The opening line of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is, there were once 4 children named Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. And it hit me that he had started the book, changed the names. I don't know what happened to Martin and Rose and Anne. That's who it was. And I don't know how Peter went from last to first. But it just made me really interested in how this story evolved for him and what in his life might have contributed to it. So I wrote down the 7 events I could see in there. Not direct lines, but almost dreamy lines. These connections between, for example, sitting in the attic as a young child with his brother Warnie, making up an entire land on rainy days in Boxen, on rainy days in the little end room of the attic, in Belfast, Ireland, overlooking the Belfast Bay, and they made maps and talking animals, and how could that not have carried forth? And the holiday he took with his mum to the north of Ireland to see Dunluce Castle, which is this stunning and amazing medieval castle on a cliff overlooking the Irish Sea. It looks straight out of some movie of like Game of Thrones, or it's just this unbelievable castle ruin. And Lewis, he did say that was an inspiration for Cair Paravel. So there were some things that he had said, but some that were very subtle, and you could see. His goddaughter was named Lucy, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. So there are these little connections in there.
Well, so you've now written 2 books about C.S. Lewis. He's not, I wouldn't say the main character in these books. He's a peripheral but significant character. And I'm wondering, before you started writing about C.S. Lewis, what was his significance in your life? Has he influenced your reading life, your writing life, even your faith development? What does C.S. Lewis mean to you? Or what did he mean to you before, and what does he mean to you now?
He is probably, if I'm going to make a list of authors, the most influential author in my life. Just probably he's the one person I've read the longest, if anything. So even putting that on the scale. But I grew up, my father is a Presbyterian pastor, and I grew up in a house full of books and a house full of C.S. Lewis books. And when I was quite young, too young to have done so, I pulled the screw tape letters off the shelf. But I was a bookworm.
That's still my favorite.
It's one of my favorite. That and Pilgrim's Regress. I love
that's
those.
a great one.
Yeah, and I found that one really young also. And I read the screw tape letters, like I said, when I was too young to have read it, and was terrified of Satan, of course. But then I fell through the wardrobe door of Narnia and read all of the Chronicles. And I've been reading him all my life. I've read, I'm sure there are some works of his I haven't read. I don't know which ones they are, but I'm sure that there are. And what is fascinating to me about his work is that it's a living thing. His work is living and breathing. So if I read something in college or high school and picked it up again as a mom, right? Yes. It was a completely different book. Pilgrim's Regress was that way for me. I read it in college and then read it again when I had kids. I think even the Narnia Chronicles change as we grow older.
Absolutely.
What
when
you
read
see
them
in them
with your child as opposed to when you were a child,
yes.
It's a completely different. When I read them as a child, I didn't even pick up on the Christian allegory or any of that stuff. I mean, I think my mom was secretly going, "Yay!" She's reading a Christian book.
But, that's what Lewis has, this great phrase he uses about why he writes some of the things he wrote, like Narnia, and he has a sign.
Smuggling in the gospel?
Yes, yes, but he has a name for it. He calls it getting past the Watchful Dragons. So there's this idea, you probably don't know this unless you're a true Lewis reader. He has a science fiction trilogy called Paralandra, but whatever he could use to sneak past your watchful dragons, he would use, and I love that. I love that phrase because I think that's what story does.
Well, Mere Christianity brought me back
That was
to
not
the faith.
fiction.
No, not fiction. I'm just saying that when I was in my early 40s, it brought me back to the faith after 20 years away. I remember being on the I'm sorry, I know this is about Patti, but y'all have to hear this.
It's about Lewis.
This is about Lewis, right? I remember being on the elliptical machine at the YMCA reading some chapter of Mere Christianity, and just like tears are streaming down my face at the why, because he gave me a way to think about God. I had lost my faith in college, and then graduate school really sealed the deal because you're around all these smart people who don't believe in God, and you read all these writers, and you're like, well, I can either be a believer or a thinker, and I'm a thinker. I'm going to be a thinker. But Lewis allowed me to be a thinker and a believer. And then I went back and read everything. I mean,
Well-
He's the most meaningful writer in my life also.
And I think too that sometimes you can read a whole chapter on an elliptical, and other times you have to read one sentence 25 times
Absolutely.
and then chew on it for a year. I mean, he was just.
I've recommended that book to friends, and they'd be like, "I can't get through this.
Then it's not the right
I'm like,
time.
what? No, yeah, put it down.
Pick it up
Because
in
if you
2
like
years,
it, you
3
will
years.
probably devour it.
Yeah, you can.
Okay. I should get back to your book though. Let's see.
It's more fun to talk about him.
Okay, here's a question that's Lewis and you. Okay, in Once Upon a Wardrobe, and I don't think this is a spoiler, we've already talked about the fact that little George Devonshire is very ill, and he knows that he's not long for this world. He tells us that at the beginning. Do you think that his knowledge of his own impending death plays into his obsession with Narnia? Is that part of the question he's asking?
Oh, 100%. And George came to me whole. Like George just appeared to me as this young boy. I mean, the opening lines of the book are George Henry Devonshire knows, right? There's no, I'm not trying to pull the wool over your eyes or my eyes or the reader's eyes or offer false hope. The opening line is that he knows. And he was the perfect character just as he appeared. Sometimes characters appear or they show up on the page and they shift dramatically through the writing and through time. But George came to me exactly as he was, exactly as he was meant to be. And why it's so important to him to understand where Narnia came from is because he wants to know if there's something more. If what we see is all there is there an unseen? Yes, he understands it's not behind a wardrobe door, but if this place came to a mortal man, is there something more that we can't see, that this man can see? I think the line in there is that this man knows something. What that something is, George wants to know. And so, yes, Narnia represents that something more. It represents the unknown. It represents a land where a child can walk through a door and he is royalty, and there's a throne waiting for him, and that there is someone or something who cares. And yet he was also the perfect character because in the book, Lewis does not tell you these stories of his life. What happens is Lewis tells them to Megs tells them to George, and we see the moments of Lewis's life, these powerful moments in his life, through an 8-year-old's eyes, through the imagination. I often describe that I feel like George is living in this little liminal space. Yeah, and that we get to see Lewis's life through the liminal space and the kind of numinous area that this little boy lives in with his imagination. And then he's battling his sister's logic, and this just goes back and forth.
One thing I love is that we also get to see Megs, the older sister, who is a physicist and very logical and very proudly logical. We get to see her transform from pure logical to she becomes a storyteller by the end of the book, and it changes her. I don't want to give any spoilers, but it changes Megs.
No story's worth anything without transformation. Right. Of course she changes.
Well, and as I was reading it, I was thinking about the fact that I happen to know that Patti, before she became a best-selling fiction writer, was a pediatric nurse, right? A clinical pediatric nurse. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if, I've asked you this and you said not really, but I'm going to ask it again for their benefit, if the character of Megs, who starts out so logical and mathematic and becomes a storyteller and learns to appreciate the world of the imagination, I wondered if she was sort of you, the two sides of you dueling that out yourself.
I think that I'm going to go back to our Latin days.
Yeah,
ready?
Absolutely.
So in English, we have one word for word.
Amo, amasama. No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I forgot all that. There's one word for word in the English language. It's word. But the root of the word, there's more. One is logos, which means logic, and one is mythos, which means myth. And as we know, story is what transforms the heart. I bet from this pulpit right here, mostly you hear some beautiful stories, because that is what changes us, our stories. We are literally wired for and made for story as humans. I think
That's
that
actually kind of scientific when you
it
put
is
it like that.
scientific. and I think that's what Lewis is talking about when he says, getting past the Watchful Dragons is that power of story. And I think that Megs and George are the two parts in all of us, and definitely in me, and that is logic and myth, and that we can't plant our flag in just logic or just imagination and fantasy world, because if we only rely on logic, what are we missing? And if we only are relying on fantasy and imagination and untetheredness,
We won't be able to pay the bills.
we won't be able to pay the bills. I know some people like that. But how do we meld the two? How do we marry the two? And I was about halfway through this book, which is usually where one of two things happens. I go, click, I see what's happening, or I fall into despair, give it up and put it aside, and I see something shiny over here I want to write, which is what happened with Surviving Savannah, and my friends didn't let me quit, and I am so happy. But that didn't happen here. About halfway through, I realized how George was standing there as pure representation of imagination, and Megs was standing there as pure representation of logic. And so I asked myself, how do we meld those two? And one of my favorite quotes from my beloved Joy Davidman is that when she realized that there was a spiritual life, she said, she realized that life is too intense to be endured with logic alone. And then I remembered a quote Lewis had that I do have in the book, which is that imagination is the organ of meaning. That imagination is how we make meaning out of things. And so when I thought about logic versus imagination and how I didn't want them to battle each other, how do you not have them battle each other? And that's through love. And Megs and George love each other very much. And it was the only thing that was going to meld the two. And so yes, I think Megs is in me. I think George is in me. I think those two systems of operation are in all of us, and we're always trying to figure out where to plant our flag or not.
In a way, since George kind of brings Megs around, and he's not going to grow up, so he doesn't really need to come around to logic. I mean, bless his heart,
Yeah. But he does in some ways, right?
He is logical, and he knows he's not pretending that he's not going to die. He understands that he has a real physical problem that's not going to allow him to live in this realm.
Yes, exactly.
But he knows that there's more. Is anybody out here actually a member of this church, or are you all from other places?
Oh, hi.
Hi, church members.
Hi. Glad you guys came.
I'm assuming you're all kind of C.S. Lewis interested, curious at least. And one thing I've noticed about Lewis throughout my years of reading and talking to other believers and non-believers alike, it seems that like Protestants and Catholics and evangelicals and mainline Protestants like myself, because I go to a Presbyterian church in Beaufort, and all the other categories that we tend to divide ourselves into, they all seem to love C.S. Lewis.
Everyone.
And they all sort of have this proprietary, like, he's one of ours, he's one of us. Everybody thinks he's one of us. What do you think it is about Lewis that makes him transcend all these divisions? I mean, he has specific beliefs that he expresses in his work, but nobody gets mad at him about his beliefs if they.
Some people do.
Oh, you're probably right.
I think scholars debate some of that. We don't.
I'm sure they do.
We probably don't
I know you don't
understand
think
what they're
of yourself.
debating. Right.
You don't think of yourself as a scholar, but I think you are by now, a Lewis scholar.
And there's probably things I disagree with him on, and there's probably things he would have shifted a little bit on in
Exactly.
especially about women especially after he met Joy. But I think it is fascinating the way people claim Lewis. One of the most frustrating things for me is seeing misquotes by him on memes. It literally makes me insane.
It drives me bonkers.
Oh my
and
gosh.
I feel like I've corrected people so many times, and now I'm just like, oh, y'all go ahead and keep posting those memes.
Keep posting those memes with the quote he never said. But What shifted for me is that I didn't view him, I don't think I did, and if I did, it wasn't fully, as human, as a fully embodied human man. I looked at him as this amazing author who lived in this fairy tale kind of house in the city of Oxford, in the country of Oxfordshire. If I thought about him at all as a man, mostly I just thought about his work.
I kind of thought of him as God for a while, but go ahead.
Yeah, but well, you think of him as a statue or a chiseled,
Yeah.
and in writing these books and in doing my research and in getting to know his stepson and all of that, Lewis was just very, of course, very human, very broken. He had a lot of really sad and tragic things happened to him in his life. He lost his mother when he was 9 years old. He had an abusive boarding school. He was in World War I and was injured and watched a man he loved die right next to him and take a bullet he probably should have taken. He, had heartbreak. And when you start to see him as a fully embodied man who yet also wrote these extraordinary things that shift our hearts and change our lives, that he becomes much more than a statue. And what I found fascinating too after I wrote this book is how many people didn't realize that the man who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia also wrote all these other things.
I have found most
I
people...
thought that was interesting.
Yeah, a lot. And I know so many people who have only read the Chronicles of Narnia. And you're like, what's your favorite Lewis book? They'll choose one of the 7 Chronicles of Narnia. And I'm like, dude, you need to read some of his adult stuff because it's really good. I mean, if you had to choose a favorite, you said earlier, what did you say? Your Pilgrim's Regress, right?
I love it.
It's been a very long time since I read that, so I can't.
I don't think I could can you pick a favorite? I don't think I could.
For me, it's like
different times of
mere
life.
Christianity because it brought me back to my faith. It was just, it's a special place in my heart, as they say. I think the Screwtape Letters is so clever, and sometimes I've thought all the wisdom in the world that you would ever need to understand this life is in that little slim volume. I thought The Great Divorce was amazing. Go ahead.
The Great Divorce, amazing. And then I think at different times in our lives, different books hit in different ways. But Lewis was in church, so he sat in the same pew every time at this small church in Oxfordshire. And he would sit, this is all true, I am not making this up, he would sit behind the pillar. There were these big it's a gorgeous church, these big stone pillars. And he would sit behind the stone pillar in case the pastor said something he didn't agree with, so he wouldn't see his face. And he was sitting in church one Sunday, and I guess his mind was wandering, as can happen rarely.
Never.
In church,
Never.
Stephanie. And the pastor, or the Episcopal priest it was an Anglican church, was, I guess, telling them how to behave or what to do. And he had this idea, and he just thought to himself, I wonder what it would be if it was the opposite and there was a master devil telling the minor devils how to live their life. And that's where Screwtape Letters came from. And he wrote it in like 2 weeks.
Am I correct in remembering that he then looked back on it and didn't like it very much at some point in his life?
I've never heard that.
I remember reading that somewhere. It also famously was David Foster Wallace's favorite novel. I don't know if you...
Really?
Yeah, the brilliant, now dead guy of our generation.
He took his own life.
They found his 10 top novels list, and everybody was shocked that the Screwtape Letters was his #1 favorite novel. I was like, yes!
Oh, wow. It is genius. It is genius. But he thought about it in church, sitting behind the pillar where the pastor couldn't see his face. So I think that's funny. I love that. Maybe you don't think that's interesting. I think that's
I don't
great.
know. If you've read the Screwtape Letters, it's very interesting. I did not know that story. I don't know. We're getting on towards the point now where we've got 20 minutes left, and I'm wondering if any of you have questions for Patti. Oh, gosh. Come on now. There's somebody.
Yeah.
Oh, has anybody seen that?
I have not. She's talking about a movie that just came out called The Reluctant Convert by a man named Max McLean. Max McLean has a very famous theater company in New York called Fellowship of something something, and it does nothing but Lewis programs. And Max has a one-man show at Fellowship for the Performing Arts in New York City, and he has a one-man play called The Reluctant Convert, and he plays Lewis and has honed this this one-man play to a fine point. Like, he's got the cave of Lewis's voice.
Have you seen the actual play?
I have seen the play. I've been to the play.
There's just a tidbit that the movie was on here in Bluffton, I think, on the 3rd. Is that where
It's gonna be again.
It's going to
I
be
think
on
it's
tonight
tonight.
again, I think
Yep.
at 5:30, so y'all can scoot right out of here and go see
So
it. Although it's probably sold
he
out.
gathered the same director that did Shadowlands, and they filmed during COVID, actually, in Oxford. And it is the life story of Lewis, according to Max's, that follows the same arc as Max's play, The Reluctant Convert. I haven't seen it yet. I'm dying to see it. I love Max. We're pals. I can't. Yes. Yep. With what, ma'am? Religiosity. That's why he's so enduring. Yes. It just came out. You're okay. Yep. It's only someone with his mind can. It's like a matrix thing for him, right?
I don't think anybody's ever done it better.
Nobody's done it better.
That I've read anyway.
Yep. Yep. Well, what's fascinating too, I think, and I think a lot of you here are probably interested in Lewis. And it's in my book. But what's fascinating is, he ended up being pulled out of school and being tutored privately by a man named Kirkpatrick that he called the Great Knock. But so he was privately, one-on-one, tutored through all the classics, having to read in Greek. He was not in a regular school. He was taught to think critically. He was not allowed to even talk to the Kirkpatrick and form an opinion until he knew why he had the opinion he had. So his mind was formed and molded that way, and we don't do that. So he could think critically about something, argue with himself about it, and still come around to a great and profound faith. And there's just been nobody who's done it better, I don't think. So I'm glad that you've seen the movie. I've heard it's my parents saw it. They said it's amazing. So anyone else?
I wish there were. Do you feel like there is anybody like Lewis writing today? I mean, do we have a modern day? I mean, he is the modern day Lewis because he's wasn't that long ago. But I don't know of anybody doing what he did today.
What do you think out there? Stephanie, what do you think?
Sort of mixing fiction and philosophy and theology. And I mean, plenty of writers mix all those things, but I can't think of a Lewis today. No. I wish there were one. Nope. We sure could use one. Yep. I remember reading that Lewis wasn't really that into politics, but maybe...
Oh, no, he was not into politics. He didn't like to talk about it. His brother, Warnie, was. He did not want to talk about it. He did not want to engage in it. He did do some broadcasts during World War II
Well, didn't he broadcast Mere Christianity?
That's what,
chapter
and
by
then
chapter?
those turned into Mere Christianity.
Okay.
Yes. Anybody else? I know you have questions. What's next? Woof. A nap, man.
One more book about C.S. Lewis.
No. So last year I had 4 works come out from December to December. I had an Audible original come out last December called Wild Swan, which is a novella about Florence Nightingale. That was a fascinating book to write, or novella to write. It is narrated by Cynthia Erivo, who is this Tony, people who nod know who she is. She's unbelievable. It's the only Audible book she's ever done. She's an Tony Award-winning Broadway star. So she read it, and then Surviving Savannah came out in March, and then I'm part of a group of writers who wrote novellas for Dorothea Benton Frank in Reunion Beach to honor her when she passed 2 years ago, and then this just came out. So,
So you're taking a break now, right?
I'm always
and
writing.
she has a new grandchild.
I have a new
in
grandbaby.
Hawaii.
Yeah, I have a new grandbaby who's going to come home for a month. But I am working on something, and it's at that squishy, tender time where if I start talking about it, your faces will go blank because I haven't figured out how to talk about it yet, and then I'll dissipate the energy. But I can tell you this. It's set in England again, and it was inspired a little bit by the children who were sent away to live in the countryside, just like in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but it doesn't have to do with Lewis at all. So,
I have a question. While I was reading Once Upon a Wardrobe, I kept thinking, this would make a wonderful movie.
yeah, me too.
Really? Oh, I'm wondering if any of your books have been optioned for movies, or if you've got any movies, Patti Callahan book-inspired movies on the horizon.
They're always nibbling, they're always talking. Right now, 2 people are trying to make an old Christmas novella I have called The Perfect Love Song into a
Hallmark.
movie.
Hallmark.
I think they want it to be like a 4-part, because it's about country music, and it's about, and then there is a pilot and a production company for Becoming Mrs. Lewis, but nothing's happened yet. And then
Have you cast that in your head?
all the time.
Who would play Joy?
All the time. And then a producer has wardrobe and is trying to attach a screenwriter. But those are all that's all pie in the sky until
I
somebody
have
writes
the
a
perfect
check.
screenwriter.
Do
but
you?
We'll talk later.
Okay. It's all pie in the sky. I mean, people can be interested and producers can be excited and write pilots, but until something happens, it's worth nothing. So
I used to talk to Pat Conroy about that stuff when his books were being optioned and this, that, and the other. Now, several of those did work out for him,
Yeah, a few
of course,
did.
but some didn't, and it was just
Some never happened.
such a hassle.
Yeah.
There's so much that has
Yep.
to go into it.
And he didn't like his movies, did he?
He liked The Great Santini.
He did? Okay.
Yeah, I think that was his favorite. He did not, I don't think, Jonathan's out there. Did he love any of the other movies, Jonathan?
I love that. That's a great answer. My friend Kathy, Mary Kay Andrews, I know a lot of you ladies here read her, and she always says, I cashed the check. Like, whatever. That's all I have to, after that.
I mean, Pat was always very
After
gracious,
that, it's-
too.
yeah.
He'd say, once you sell the rights, it's their movie. It's not your movie anymore. You really can't complain. But I happen to know that he did like The Great Santini.
Yeah, it's a great movie. I'll never forget that scene with the basketball on the back of the head. Never, my whole life. Anybody else have a question? Yes, ma'am. Hi, Diane. She asked if I would recommend reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe before I read this book. No. I mean, I think one of the great things about, or what I wanted when I wrote this book, was that you would have to know nothing about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to enjoy my novel. And that was important to me because I didn't want it to be a fan fiction it is a completely separate story that at its heart is about the origin of stories, about this mystical quality of stories that arise out of nothing, or what appears to be nothing, how imagination and logic can work together, and about how, like I said before, that there are these things you can see in books that might be from an author's life, and yet there are these large, swaths, like I said, of story source that are unexplainable, that are ineffable, that are mysterious, and the power of story to change our lives, what literature means to us. And The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe just was the best vehicle for that, but you don't have to have ever read it, nor do you ever have to read it.
But you're probably going to want to.
But I was going to say, I think what's interesting, so if you've never read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and never even seen the movie, what's fascinating is the way it's entered our consciousness. Because even if you've never read it or ever seen the movie, you know who Aslan is. You know who the White Witch is, right? And so there's something about those characters that has entered our consciousness, even if you've never read the books. But I do think that if you read Once Upon a Wardrobe and then read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe again, you will see it with some new eyes, which might be fun. But it is not a mandatory reading assignment.
I would also like to add that there's a very sweet love story in the book.
Yes.
That's not between the little brother and his sister, but is between the sister and a boy. Mm-hmm. And it's really beautiful, and I was not expecting that. And
Patrick.
What a great character he was.
He was so much fun.
I love him.
So they say that when there are two opposing forces that seem either or, what's best to do is bring in a third. That's our Richard Rohr roots right there, right? And for me, that third was Patrick in the book. And does anybody here watch BBC Mysteries TV? Okay. Do y'all know Endeavor?
Oh my, Patty, we've talked about this. We worship Endeavor, remember?
Sean Evans.
When is the next season coming out?
I don't know. I check like once a month.
Me too. Once a week for me.
So Sean Evans plays Endeavor, who is a prequel to Morse.
Inspector Morse,
Inspector Morse.
Right.
And it's set in Oxford. And a funny story about Endeavor and Sean Evans, who plays.
Oh, don't tell me you met Sean Evans.
Oh, I wish.
Oh my gosh. You're gonna leave your husband for
No,
him, Patty.
no, Pat. If you're watching, I promise I won't. He's a little young for me.
Jeff, I would.
He's a little young for me, but
Me too.
When I was writing Becoming Mrs. Lewis, and I was getting ready to go to England and do some research, someone told me, you should watch this show called Endeavor because it is set in 1950 Oxford. So when I first watched the show, it was because I wanted to see the scenes of 1950s Oxford. So anyway, total tangent to tell you that I imagined Patrick as Sean Evans.
I wish you had told me that before I read, but now I'm gonna.
You can see it?
Yeah, I can totally see it.
And then here's another little
He's
Easter
such a
egg.
cute man.
He's just so controlled
Oh.
and vulnerable at the same time. And that's how I pictured Patrick, controlled and vulnerable at the same time. But here's another Easter egg, some other Easter eggs I've hidden in the story. One is that Patrick is Sean Evans. The other is that there are three main characters aside from Lewis and Warnie, and that's Megs, the sister, George, the brother, and Patrick, the love interest and friend from Oxford, and whose father is a math teacher. And so Patrick is constantly battling that too. But my son and father's name is George. My daughter's name is Megan, and my husband and middle son are Patrick. I've never done that before. I've never combined.
Now you'll never
in that
stop
way.
doing it. I think
No,
that's
I've
great.
never used family names like that. But this book felt personal. Like I said, I was writing it during the pandemic.
It's a
and
very personal
Yeah, it
book.
felt
It will
personal.
feel personal to everyone who reads it. It's just really, you were writing it during the pandemic. I was reading it during. I just feel like we're living in such a swirling, confusing, dark time right now, and
all the light we can find.
right. In this book, I wouldn't want to call it an escape because there are sad and dark things that happen in this book, but there's something still so cozy and hopeful and enchanting about this book. And it's you want to curl up on a day like we've been having all weekend that finally improved. You want to curl up on one of those kind of weekends and just devour this book with a cup of tea. It's just It's that kind of book, and I highly recommend it.
All right, y'all. Thank you so much for coming. Y'all are awesome.
Yeah,
I
this
will
was
be
good.
back there with the books and signing if you want to ask anything. I'm really happy you took your Sunday to come out and hang out with us. You could
I
have
want to
done a
say
lot of things.
one more thing because I'm looking at Jonathan. This was the final episode of the Pat Conroy Literary Festival, the 6th annual, and it's a wonderful festival. We also have some books out there called Our Prince of Scribes, Writers Remember Pat Conroy. Patty and I both have essays in that. I cannot stay for the signing. I have another engagement, but you might want to pick that up because it's a wonderful book. And please join us next year for the 7th annual Pat Conroy Literary Festival.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And thank you to
Jonathan
the Presbyterian
is amazing.
Church. Thanks.